Today is the 5th, May
Right.
5th.
May 5th.
Already
Cinco de
started
Mayo.
already, just so you know, Amanda.
Well, yeah, we'll edit it out.
We'll edit it
Okay.
later.
My name is Amanda Phelps, and today is May 5th, 2010. Please state your name and date of birth.
John H. Hobica, M.D. My date of birth is July 27th, 1926.
What branch of service were you in?
I was in the, actually drafted, and I was in the United States Navy.
And you were a nurse?
I was in the hospital corps of the United States Navy. Yeah, in other words, I was actually a hospital corpsman, which is equivalent to a male Navy nurse.
Mm-hmm. How old were you when you were drafted?
I was 18 years old. I was drafted while I was attending Hamilton College in 1944. They drafted me in January of 1945.
So you were in college when they drafted you?
Yes.
What were you going to college for?
I was going to college to do pre-med at Hamilton College, and at that time we had the selective service. When you reached the age of 18, you automatically had to register with the draft board, and then when your number comes up, you then have to you have to go to a training facility where they give you a physical examination, and then if you pass, then you be inducted into the armed forces. I was fortunate enough to get into the United States Navy.
So were you drafted as a soldier? Or
I
were
was
you
drafted as an enlisted individual because I didn't have a degree in college, and I was not a physician at the time, so I was just an ordinary plain Joe, and I got drafted as an enlisted man.
Mm-hmm. So you were able to choose to be a nurse. You chose that, right?
Well, they asked me what I had in my interview. They asked me what I was going to college for, and I told them that I was planning to pursue the field of medicine. And at that particular time, they asked me to take a test, and after I took the test, they said that I was in the Navy and that I was going to go to hospital corps school. It was an accelerated nursing school program, mm-hmm. where we spent 3 months in a hospital corps school, and this particular unit was in San Diego, California. Mm-hmm. So I was in the training or boot camp at Geneva, which is Sampson Naval Base, and they transported me and a number of other people to San Diego, where I trained to be a male nurse.
So when you were in training, were you actually working with wounded soldiers, or?
Not during the training facility. We primarily did classwork, basic studies, and when we got done with our training school, we then were transferred to various naval hospitals, and I was transferred to Jacksonville Naval Hospital, mm-hmm. which happened to be a very, very large facility in Jacksonville, Florida. And we took care of very, very badly wounded naval personnel. And I remember one particular case where it was a naval pilot who had trying to land in a carrier and smashed his plane and got burned very, very significantly, head, face, and so forth. So they stabilized him in Jacksonville, and then they transferred him to the burn center, which was a naval hospital in St. Albans, New York, which is in Long Island. And I remember that I was asked to go with him in a ambulance plane to be his nurse, transferred to the burn center. Then we discharged him there, and I turned around and went back. I mean, these are the kind of things that we took care of. We also took care of other people that were ill with either their post-surgical, or we did clinics. If any of the naval personnel were ill, we ran outpatient clinics, checked them out, see what's going on, and stuff like that. And we did this here. Unfortunately, what happened was, or fortunately for me, was when I got drafted in the service, World War II was almost over with, because I got drafted in January of 45, and World War II had been going on since 41. And then in July of 45, what happened was that they released the atomic bomb in Japan. And then, of course, Japan surrendered less than a month later. And what they did with personnel like myself, they transferred us to separation centers. And we spent over a year after the war had ended, we helped discharge all the Navy personnel from the service back to civilian life. We had to make sure that there was no disability factors that were involved, that they were in good health. We'd have to examine them and stuff like that. And, before we could get our discharge. So several years later, we ended up getting discharged, but this was a year and a half after the war had ended before we got discharged from the service. So, fortunately or unfortunately, the way I want to look at it, I didn't see much actual action. As a matter of fact, if they hadn't delivered the atomic bomb to Japan, I was scheduled to be in the Fleet Marines, and the Fleet Marines I was going to be a medic for the Fleet Marines, and then we were thinking about invading Japan at that time, but the atomic bomb falling on Japan changed the whole concept of everything, so it was kind of good for everybody.
Yeah. So the men that you took care of, were they mostly had come from battles in Asia?
They came from people that were ill on the base. They came from people that were hurt during the war, transfers, whatever. Anybody that was ill. We had a large naval hospital that had hundreds and hundreds of beds in there. And we were assigned to a particular part of the hospital. Sometimes we would be working in a place like ICU, another time we'd be working in the clinic, another time we'd be having some kind of a dispensary duty, or anything that related to the medical field is what we ended up being assigned to. And, we had certain criteria. Sometimes we'd work in the emergency room. And this was all superb, training for what I was going to do for the rest of my life, and it really, I was really very, very fortunate fortunate of being in the Navy and being a hospital corpsman, and then ending up in the field of medicine, which I did. After I got discharged, I went back and finished college, and then went to medical school, and took training in anesthesia in Boston. So it took a long time. Yeah.
So was everyone that you worked with, had they studied medicine before the war also, or were?
No, well, some of them were thrown into it. Some of them thought they might want to do it, and then later on, when they, I have a story to tell you. One of my fellow graduates from Corps School, his name was Jack Hoff. He was from Rochester, and he and I both went to Corps School. And I probably saw him, and then after he ended up going, I think, to the Great Lakes area where they had a huge hospital there. I ended up going to Florida. But I probably saw him about 40 years later. Yeah, that'd be about right. And I saw him, believe it or not, on the golf course at the Onondagas. So anyways, he asked if he could join us. I was with my son. I was taking him out. He was probably 10 or 11 years old. He's now maybe 40. So he's maybe 30 years ago. But anyways, yeah, about 1980. So he says, he says, how you doing, John? I says, fine. And we exchanged pleasantries. And I said to him, what are you doing? He asked me what I did, and I told him I was a physician, that I was in anesthesia, among other things. And he says, I kind of figured that you'd probably end up going in medicine. And I said, well, what do you do? He says, well, I got kind of tired and sick of after I finished college. I mean, he didn't want to do any more education, okay? So he and his brother started a garbage business in the city of Rochester. And then about a year or two before I met him, they had sold the garbage business to Waste Management, where you see these trucks here now. I mean, it's a huge, huge multi-corporation. Anyway, they sold it for like $15 or $20 million. And I said to myself, now why I couldn't be lucky like that? You know what I mean? So to answer your question, a lot of people didn't pursue medicine like I did. Here's a fellow that just got tired, didn't want to learn anymore, and they started a garbage business, and they made a huge success out of it.
Wow.
So you see
I
how it
have
works?
stock in that company, or did at one point.
You what?
I had stock in Waste Management.
I'll tell you something. In the early years, Waste Management was a hell of a company for stock. But then, lately, I guess, they kind of lost favor. They had more competition, and so it deteriorated. But if you had bought it low and sold it high, you could have made a lot of nice money out of it.
Well, and I didn't have very much. It was that much
Well,
that
it's all
I
right.
sold, and then helped the daughter go to college.
That's
that kind of
the
thing,
way
so.
to do it. I know. I did the same thing with my kids. I learned that all my children, instead of giving them toys or birthday presents for their birthdays and Christmas, I would buy a few shares of stock for them. And my daughters will tell you today, I have 3 of them, my daughters will tell you today that most of them used it when they got married as a down payment for the house. And they can't thank you enough for that. I figured everybody else would give them enough toys and presents and things like that.
Right.
Well, anyways, but in answer to your question, not everybody did pursue medicine.
Yeah.
And I just happened to be either lucky or devoted, or and pursued what I had intended that I wanted to be.
So when you were in Jacksonville, what was a typical day like? Did you always have someone that you were taking care of? Keep pretty busy?
We would be assigned if we were assigned in the emergency room or the clinic or what have you. There's a certain amount of duties that you had to do. You had to spend the working day over there seeing patients. If there was a problem, you had a physician on call that you can call to ask, or you took care of it yourself. And a lot of times we're able to take care of these ourselves. We're almost like a physician's assistant, so to speak. If you have a problem, you seek a higher level of advice, and most of the time you can handle it yourself. And that's what we did do.
I have a question
Yeah.
about the mental stability of a lot of the patients you had. Did you have to do any psych work with any of them?
If we did have anybody, we were encouraged to refer them out rather than try and do anything for them, primarily because we didn't have the background, and there were plenty of facilities to take care of these people. I mean, we had psych wards, and we had psychiatrists on board, and something like that could lead to some very dangerous end results if you don't take care of them properly. And subsequently, I think it was a good idea to do that because of the fact, well, you know, you have cuts, bruises, you have burns, simple ones. You can take care of those things. You do a lot of first aid. That was our basic, as I said before, because when I happened to get into the war, it was near the end. I wasn't the typical medic that would be on the battlefield treating battle wounds and stuff of that nature, because there just wasn't any by the time that we got ourselves organized. And so, or if you were in the Army and you saw people shot all over the place and stuff like that, I mean, it just didn't happen. And it was primarily because of the fact that I just wasn't old enough to be in the service at an earlier age. I mean, don't forget, the war started December 41, and I entered in January 45, which is 4 years later.
So what were you, 14, 15 when the war started then?
I
Since
was.
you were 18 when you were drafted?
I was 18 in July 45. I had just turned 18 years old.
Okay.
And, well, actually, July 44, I just
44,
turned
okay.
18.
So you were
So I had graduated from Proctor High School in June, and I started college July 1st.
Wow.
And, well, because at that time, all the colleges were on accelerated programs. And so I was able to get a year in from June or July 1st to January 1st. So when my 18th birthday came in July, I was in college. They let me finish the year, and then they said, you got to go.
Okay.
And that's the way it was with everybody. Unless you got deferred because you had an ailment, unless you got deferred because you were married and had a couple of kids, you might have gotten deferred if you had an essential type of job. But, you know, being a simple student, or unless you were in medical school or dental school, what they would do is they would defer you until you finished. And then immediately after you finished dental or medical school, you'd automatically go into service as an officer because you were a dentist or a physician.
Which would be like the TV show MASH then.
Right.
Right? Okay. Because those guys were all doctors.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. that makes sense. And they were all officers, too.
And they were all
Yep,
officers.
yep.
Yeah, of course. You had
Okay.
surgeons, and you had internists, and you had there were captains and majors and that nature. But I was a lowly enlisted man because I was I was just starting college,
Yeah.
and if they had a selective service today, everybody who turns 18 has got to register, and then they have to go in the service. They've pretty much done away with that now, but we do have some kids that like to go into the service after they graduate from high school and do very nicely for themselves.
Now, on the discharge papers, I remember seeing my dad's discharge papers, and the only thing I remember seeing, I didn't pay much attention to it, was his height. So what did you have to put on a discharge paper to discharge somebody medically?
Well, actually, the most important thing is whether you're honorably discharged or dishonorably discharged and so forth. That's the key. They don't have anything on the actual discharge paper itself.
Okay.
Okay, there's a ribbon, and there's the embossment, and like in the Navy, Secretary of Navy's on the bottom, honorably discharged,
Right.
and I have to apologize because at one time I had a picture of myself in a SWABI uniform, and I also had at one time my original discharge paper, but I've moved in the last, and it's about 60 years now since I've been gone. So, and they've disappeared some. I suppose if I continue to look for them, I may be able to find them. But anyway, they have a ribbon on the side and so forth. And you needed that when you went back to college, when you applied for stuff to show that you're honorably discharged from the service. Now, as far as the exam is concerned, what you have to do, you examine a person, check their heart, their lungs, their height, their weight, their blood pressure, make sure they have no hernias, okay? And you ask them a certain number of questions to make sure that they're reasonably sane. And you ask them if they've got any aches or pains or what have you, or their knee bothers them or their toe bothers them, because you want to make sure that this is not service related.
Okay.
Because if it is service related, now it's a brand new ball game. Now you have to take them and send them to the appropriate specialist. If, for example, they've got a bad knee incurred in the service, then you got to send them to a Naval or Army orthopedic surgeon, all right? And they have to evaluate that. Now, if they did have a bum knee, for example, that was incurred, either they may have been shot or sprained, or they're carrying another fellow colleague or whatever, okay? Then they'll have to assess a certain amount of disability for that particular individual. And these are quotation marks, disabled veterans, and they'll put a price tag. They'll put a certain, they'll label a certain percentage on there. Let's say, well, because you're going to have trouble later on, they're going to give you 35% disability. So they'll figure out at that time what the person's monthly wage is. Let's say in those days, a man made $125 a month. So they would take 35% of $125, and then that would be his disability payment. He'd get a check like that maybe for 10 years. Then they'll say after 10 years, you've got to come back and see us. If the condition has worsened, then what you do is, well, I don't know, now it may lead to a possible total knee or something like that. So now they increase to 50% or 70%, or you're now purely disabled, you can't do anything anymore, you can't get a job. so you become totally disabled.
Okay.
And that's when they increase your salary,
Okay.
your disability payment. And that's the origin of any time you become disabled, they got to attach a monetary figure to it.
Well, it's very interesting because, I mean, until I heard from what you had to say, I thought that, you just got discharged. It's
Yeah.
kind of like, okay, thanks for serving, see ya. But there's obviously a process, and it sounds like it could be a lengthy process at
It
times.
could be, but most of the people, believe it or not, most of the veterans want to get out of the service as fast as possible. They've had enough. They want to go home to their families. They want to go home, do what they want to do. Some had to go back and finish their education. Some didn't want to have anything to do with the service anymore. So a lot of people, just said, now listen, I don't want to do anything anymore. I want to get out. I feel fine. I feel great and everything else. Discharge me. And so you have to accept what they
Right.
tell you at face value,
And then that was that.
and that was that.
Okay.
That's exactly right. But it's easy to bring everybody in. I mean, the same thing when there were 300 or 400 guys like me who were 18 years old, or some were a little older because they may have been deferred for 3 months or 6 months or whatever have you, and they had a lengthy process of getting in. I mean, they had to make sure, check their eyes, their hearing, their arches, and stuff like that. And a lot of people got deferred with some stupid little things. You know what I mean? Either a bad back, or they had fallen arches,
Right.
or they couldn't hear, or their finger was arthritic, and so they couldn't squeeze the trigger. So it's not an easy phenomenon both ways.
Right.
And and a lot of people were 4F,
And what does that
and
mean?
4F is a classification.
Okay.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
1A is you're acceptable. 1 means you're in the best possible condition. A is acceptable. F stands for fail.
Okay. Okay.
So
So 4F would be
yeah, something.
pretty bad.
Well,